Hello, my name is Lizzie Karen. Welcome to my channel where I talk about the memories that I have of dream regressions in Atlantis, otherwise known as Tantal in my actual dreams. This episode is yet another in the series about stonework. So that's stonework of the ancients. I foolishly thought that I could cover everything about stonework in 2 or 3 episodes, and yet here we are at part 6. But this time we're looking at tunnelling, shafts, tube drilling, and a few other little things that I couldn't quite sneak into the other episodes. So tunnelling. This isn't too different to the previous episode, except one of the monster machines has much larger scoops. So this is the machine called Cotier. So it's the one that is specifically designed for tunnelling, and it's so much better at the whole process, whether it be horizontal tunnelling or tunnelling on a gentle incline. But remember, these were really, really big machines. I feel at this stage that I should really apologise for my graphics. They really aren't the best, but hopefully I'm getting the message across and you get the gist of what I'm actually talking about. So do you remember the metal box with all the big ice cream scoops in episode 5? Well, this is what I'm talking about again, except with this particular machine, the scoops are a lot bigger. So coming back to these ice cream scoops, well, this was really scooping on a massive scale. The scoops operated using a frequency vibration that as the scoop touched the rock, it turned to powder, where it touched without any drilling or scraping or grinding. It was simply like if we're looking at big tunnels going through ice cream. Not so great for the smaller tunnels. So there were handheld devices that worked in the same way using vibratory frequency principles, but they actually created quite a bit of a mess when you used them, whereas the big machines, they sucked out all the residue as they went along. Okay, so let's move on to shafts now, because they were very popular and they were generally designed to be within an actual structure. So much like elevators are today, but they operated on different principles. So it was assumed everyone had their own device for ascending and descending, so elevator boxes weren't needed. It was just another access way, like a hall, but it was a vertical hall, not a horizontal hall. So people would just walk along a normal hall, come across a shaft, and they would use their devices for their levitational devices for going up or down from the shaft. And it never really entered anyone's heads that we needed boxes to go up and down in, as we do in today's world. In many ancient sites where there are shafts, the original building that sat over the top of them is long gone, and so all there is left is this big hole in the ground. Shaft cutting was a bit different to all the things that we've talked about before, because these were just square or rectangular shapes that went straight down. And what was required to achieve this was a metal square. And it wasn't very big or very complicated. In fact, it just looked like a frame. Most of the frame was about 2 to 3 inches high. So this picture that I'm showing you now is about the best representation of what it looked like, but without the legs. So it was just a frame. One of the amazing things is this frame could just be folded up and put into a box. It was surprisingly lightweight, and it could be resized. You could make it into whatever size square you wanted, and then you would just lay it on the ground. It would basically start to vibrate and would just slowly sink into the ground. So it would just kept vibrating at the right frequency that it's basically sliced through the rock that it was sitting on. And the controls we had made it possible to be very exact as to where it stopped, so that it would vibrate down to a certain level and then just stop. We were able to then pull out the metal frame and start on the next stage. So essentially, this metal vibrating frame was really like a cookie cutter, because it cut into the rock as if it was dough making a cookie or a biscuit. So once we'd removed the cookie cutter, then we needed to be able to remove the actual core. And for that, we placed a similar sort of device. It was a ring, and this ring just looked like a bangle, a regular bangle. And it did its vibrational frequency thing to the same level as the shaft. And then we were able to just snap the core, the round core, the small round core, snap it out by just levering it quite easily about. It would snap off at the bottom and we would pull it out. So at this point, what we have is a shaft cut to the desired depth, but the rock is still in there. It's just an outline of a shaft. And we have a tube drill size hole also to the length of the shaft with the actual tube removed. So it's hollow. That small part in the very center of the shaft is hollow. So at this point, we can send in some of the standalone ice cream scoop devices on a long arm so they can be lowered down into the hollowed out tube area, and at the bottom they can carve out the base based on the directions we give it. I don't know why this is important, but when halfway through the scooping, we would pull out the ice cream scoop devices and we would put in some small cubes, very strong weight-bearing cubes, into the half of the shaft that had been scooped out. The ice cream scoop devices are then sent back in to finish off the scooping on the other side of the shaft. Sometimes at this point, the block seems to be leaning ever so slightly to one side. But anyway, the scooping device is finally removed and replaced with what looks like a 3 or sometimes a 4-pronged harpoon. The device goes into the core hole and the prongs flatten out against the cut floor. So this is the device which, when activated, levitates the block out of the shaft. The end result is now a fully formed, very neat shaft and a large block with a tube hole cut all the way through it. Some of these blocks were quite useful actually, especially in areas that needed a conduit. So I've described the most straightforward of the shaft making techniques, but there are other complications when shafts are cut horizontally, for example. It's more like tunneling, but the same technique can be used for doing it on a horizontal basis. There are a lot of complications with that, including the setting up of various stands and things to hold the devices in place. And of course, getting the rock out afterwards. But I'm not going to go there today. Now that I've covered all the various aspects of the shaft cutting, I think it might be obvious to everyone how a single column of rock is created. It can be done this way, or it can be done also horizontally, but the technology is basically as I've just described it. If it's not obvious, then let me know in the comments below, because that way I can clarify it. Based on all the episodes that you've now heard, hopefully you've heard the previous ones as well, you will probably have formed an idea of how the massive statues were created. I'll just quickly cover that because it's important to note that they were cut in situ. So, quick summary. The massive blocks needed for the statues were cut out from the bedrock using the scooping machines. They were scooped all four sides, and then once that was done, the scooping machine went under the block until there was just a small neck of rock remaining at each end. Then to support blocks were put in at each end. The rock that was left attached to the bedrock was then removed. So essentially this giant piece of stone is then just sitting on two supporting blocks. It was then easy to just put in the two levitating scroll rods and lift out the block. The block would then be taken to the location where the carving would take place. And that's where the carving machines, which generally were smaller versions of the machines that we've already described, would be given the design for what was to be carved and pretty much left to it until the point where the polishing would take place. Now, before I talk about polishing, I just want to come back to the fact that in my dreams, my people would carve in situ. So that meant that the big block would be transported to the location where the statue was to be carved, unless, of course, it was being carved directly out of bedrock, and, of course, there the rock is already. But you didn't actually see, when the Tantal people were doing the statues, you didn't see massive statues getting moved because they were cut in situ. So it's really strange to see documents or hieroglyphs of statues being moved by the dynastic Egyptians. And that's because they didn't carve them and then move them. They found them and moved them. But it's clear to me, because of my dreams, that the statues were being moved in a picture like this. And you can see one of the people pouring down oil, I think it is, in order to make it easy for these statues to be moved on a sled. And isn't it amazing that they would actually not move the whole block and then carve it if they had the technology to carve it? Because it's risking the statue way more by moving it once carved than moving the block and then carving it. I mean, just imagine going to all that work, carving a statue, and then you start moving it and something happens and all that work has been for nothing. Isn't it much better just to move your block? And, you know, if your block chips a corner off, well, you can work around it when you're doing your carving. But you can't really do anything about it if you're moving a statue. So the statue moving, that is utter nonsense. And it's just so totally illogical. So let's talk about polishing now. Whether it's a large one piece of stone sarcophagus or whether it's a beautifully carved statue of a person sitting or standing or whatever, if it has a high level of polish, then a fair chance is that the technique I'm going to describe next has been used on it. How would we get a really nice surface today? Well, I guess, let's say a piece of rock. We might grind it till it's nice and flat, and then we might sand it, or use some kind of tool to just smooth it out a bit. But then what would we do? We've got a nice flat even surface. We'd polish it, or even like use some kind of polish on it? Using the tools that we've got today and the diamond sandpaper and stuff like that, it's still quite a lot of work. But it was quite different, the approach, in my dream regressions. I mean, you still had to do stuff, but it wasn't elbow grease required like it is today, even with the machines. So let's talk about my dream regressions and what I saw in terms of polishing, because once the great machines are done their work, and you had an item, whether it be a statue or a stone box, and you wanted it to be really, really smooth and beautifully polished, a substance was applied to it. Now, this substance was slightly yellowish, and the nearest thing I can describe it to is honey. It looked very much like honey. So the substance could be just poured on. So like if you were dealing with a straight, flat object, that's pretty easy. You just pour it on. But it could be applied other ways as well. Actually getting it on to the item was probably the most work involved in the whole process, because once the substance was on the stone item, all that was needed was to apply the vibration, and that could be done putting the item onto a kind of mat. But once the vibration was applied, it didn't really take very long, maybe 5 minutes, for the substance to do its job, and the surface was amazingly smooth. So all that was left over at that point was just some very, very fine dust. Here's where this technique differs from the techniques we would use today. So let's just imagine that we had made a box, a square piece of stone, and we wanted to polish it, but we hadn't made the surface absolutely flat. It wasn't perfect, but we decided to just go ahead and polish it anyway. We would put the polishing substance on it and apply the vibrational frequency, and it would be beautifully polished. But wherever there was a difference, like if we had a slightly incorrect gradient on one surface, it would just be a very beautifully polished incorrect gradient. Polishing was done not just because it looked nice, which obviously it did, but also it was believed that by polishing a stone item, it limited the amount of erosion that would occur on it. I'm not sure how true that was, though. So before I forget, there was one more machine that I hadn't quite squeezed in so far. And this machine there was quite a few handheld machines, but this one is just a little bit different. Most of the other handheld machines are just like small versions of the big machine, but this one was, if you imagine a rod, well, any kind of stick, in fact, and then on that rod, you put the ice cream scoop devices that we talked about. But you make those devices so tiny, and you make them all in a line, and so they're absolutely tiny and all in a line, attached to this rod with a handle on it. And it's so tiny that you can't actually see these little tiny scoops. And what you end up with is this device whereby when you switch on the frequency and you take this device up close to a piece of stone, you can literally slice through that piece of stone with the device when it's vibrating. So I've tried to fit a lot into this last episode because I wanted to squeeze in all the little bits and pieces, but there may be bits that I've missed out on putting in, or there may be questions that you have, and I would be very happy to answer any questions that you have. So just leave me a question in the comments, and I think I better call it a day on this episode. Well, thank you everybody, and I'll be talking to you in the next episode. Bye.